Hello and welcome to this video. Today I'm going to customize this tiny Doorable's house, and this one has a neat function because it spins and reveals the characters. So that is why I decided to actually keep it and, not display characters but to do something else with it. But first I need to peel off these stickers. The first one was kind of okay actually, surprisingly so. The second one I struggled with. And it took me so long. The problem is it is a plastic covered sticker, so I had a hard time with glue gun and rubbing alcohol to get it off. And yeah, it came off in chunks the entire time. I was glad once I actually got the plastic coated pieces off so I could have it soak. But yeah, I guess if they make it as a toy and they want it as the label that should stay on the object, it would make total sense that it takes this much time, but still not that fun when you want to remove it for a project. So I want to turn this house into a fairy tale inspired house, so I'm starting by carving XPS foam. These sheets I have gotten left over from other projects. Essentially I'm just using my wire cutter, putting it with the prongs on the table. I have one of those U-shaped ones with a wire going across the U-shapes. And you have a little bit of distance between the prongs and the top of the wire. So if you just put the top of the U, I guess, onto the table straight and pull the foam through, you can easily get these thin strips. I used my X-Acto to carve lines at first, and then I found that my needle tool actually works a little bit better. Then I just carved brick patterns. Some bricks I left larger, some smaller, and after an hour of carving I finally had enough strips to cover the entire thing. I was debating on using a paper mold or paper pattern wrapped around this and tried to wrap it in one go. But then I realized that the foam is a little too stiff for that, and also that the surface with the plastic will be hard to stick things to. So first of all I need to fix that in just using a sanding stick or a cheap paper nail file, and just roughing up the surface, making sure that the glue will hold. And then I'm using PVA glue for most of the surface. I don't think it will really stick, but I think it may shape the foam. And then for some spots, especially on the beginning and the end of each strip, I'm using super glue. But since I have gel super glue, which doesn't eat into the foam too much, it's definitely not foam safe one, but it does help prevent it from melting too much. It definitely takes a little longer to dry. That means I needed to tape things. And that meant that I could only work section by section, which means I had to wait for everything to dry and hold. And only this process took about 2 days of work time because of the drying times. These small sections of 2 rows are the max I could do at once, because else I was fiddling with trying to tape it down and it lifting off. I had one sections where I tried 3, and I did have a loose spot of foam that I didn't it wasn't noticeably immediately there, but you could feel it when you painted it and stuff, and I was worried that if I had too many, they would come loose. So, small sections and a lot of tape it was. And then while I was going around, I also tried to minimize my foam usage, since I barely could finish this project. So I actually already cut out the windows, which was way easier than I thought it would be. And then I used my wire cutter, and my camera of course didn't record and I didn't notice, but I carved a wave into another strip of foam, and I'm going to use that as the roof support stones, essentially. At least that is what I'm trying to make them look. But with one caveat. I need this thing to still spin, so I need to attach it with a gap in a way that it still can. And then I also tested out if the door would still work, and it didn't quite. But I wanted to add a frame anyway, so I carved away like a little chunk on the side of each foam piece. You can see I kind of glued them with a little bit of space anyways. And then I used a pencil sideways and a piece of paper like just put over, and I tried to trace it to get like the optimal shape here, because the door is very asymmetrical, same as the windows, but with the door with the like arc on the side it was like even harder. So I just used this paper as a template and tried to make that fit. I did need to adjust it a little bit each time, but once I had it, I cut it out of spare foam. I used 2 pieces here because I knew that I wanted to engrave like a stone pattern, so it didn't really matter if I had like one joint. But yeah, this actually worked really well. I did try to like properly trace how thick I needed to have it by holding it up to the plastic and then pre-cutting it. And I also needed to like keep the hinge free so the door could fully open and, you know, have it not be in the way of the door. And once I had it carved down to the thickness that I need, it was tape and glue time again. And this time I'm using just pure super glue because of like the thickness of the foam, because it's like way stiffer, so it doesn't curve around as nicely. So just super glue it was. Also ignore the big pile of super glue bottles. I tend to, for certain projects, use a new bottle because it's tedious to squeeze out the old ones, and then I collected all of my old ones in a pile. And that's what you see here. So I tried to use up some of those, and for this entire project I actually managed to get away with using 3 of my old bottles, which is nice. Or I guess tubes in this case. And then for the windows, I wanted to have accent stones, or foam pieces I guess. So I carved away little tiny margin around every window, trying to keep the shape of the windows. I did have a little bit of an issue because the edges of the windows are rounded, so I needed to cut my foam a little bit larger, and in some cases I actually went in with my X-Acto and carved out a tiny bit of the plastic to make it not show. But I just added a strip of foam on the top and bottom of each window, let that dry with some tape of course, and then I added 2 more strips on each side of the windows. And of course, without realizing that my camera wasn't recording again, I added the curved pieces that I carved earlier. It seems like those pieces really don't want to be on camera. And with that, I always make sure that it still turns. And I purposefully left the lower edge where you grab it, just so that I have a sturdy piece to grab onto and still twist the top, because the foam is way too like soft to hold onto for like putting pressure on it. I did need to lengthen the roof a little bit, just so it matches with the support beams and my vision. So I cut an angled strip of my foam and just wrapped it around, and I needed to do this in parts, so stick down the first part, waiting for it to dry a little bit, sticking down the next one, and while I was working on that I just also filled in the chimney reuse spot thing. I think this is so you can put a figure there, but I decided to have it be like a rooftop window-esque thing. So I added a triangle that I cut out of my foam and a flap bit just to fill in the inside so I have something to stick it to. And then I wanted to add a window, and because this is so small I decided to use some, in this case just watercolor paper. It has a little bit more thickness than printer paper, and I always have like leftover scraps from other projects. So that's what I used here, cutting it into thin strips after I got the basic shape of the front. And then I'm layering them in this like lattice work. Just using a base square and then like these tiny strips. And then I also add even smaller strips around all the edges to make like the window trim. My idea here is to have the window be wood shutters, essentially. So I'm adding strips all around the edges and then 2 strips in the middle to make it look like they're 2 shutters. I, in the end, also realized that what I did didn't make too much sense because, you know, it wasn't carved into the top and bottom outer frame strips, but that's okay. I only realized that after painting, but as long as it looks like a window, I'm happy with it. And then it was time for the next super tedious task, the roof. I cut out shingles. I just used an old piece of cardboard. I think this was the back of a calendar or something. And I cut strips that are fairly even, just for eye a little bit. I wanted these to look a little bit like the normal like stone roof tiles that they had in the olden days. So a bit of unevenness was actually wanted. And then I made sure that none of the foam bits would get in the way, except for the angled edge that I purposefully cut for it to support this. And I, in this case, just used PVA glue and I glued these on. That being said, I used a lot of glue to make this work, but in the end it was surprisingly sturdy. I did use the non-shiny side of the paper, which helped, which also means that I need to gesso it later, but that's totally fine. I'd rather have it stick better than being able to paint it without priming it. Plus, priming or gessoing is not that bad, so it may actually fill in some of the gaps that I have with the pink. But yeah, I spent about 2 hours, to admit it took that long, to layer all the shingles, and then for the top ones I cut them in like a teardrop shape almost. And then for the final bits to fill in all the gaps on the very top, I put thin rectangles around the entire bit. And I just left the rounded part on top as is, as like a little feature. As for the tiny slanted roof on top of the window that I made, I added tiny pieces of cardboard and I just cut in some slits at an even distance, and then I carved away tiny triangles on the tips of those, just to have that layered shingle look again. And then I made sure to alternate that look and cut out strips and glue those onto each side. Once again, another thing I forgot besides carving in the window thing was to add like a tiny folded piece on top, you know, just as a finishing strip, but that's fine. If you don't know, you hardly notice, but I guess now all of you know. As for the door, I added super glue and some strips of foam, and while that was drying, since I could already work on the rest of the building, I decided to gesso it. And in the process, I'm making sure that all the gaps and all the colored pieces wouldn't show. So I used an extra amount for like all the gaps in between the stones, or you know, my foam pieces. And I made sure to really cover the roof shingles. And then I started to paint the roof shingles first in black. And the rest of the house in grey as a contrast color. I wanted to have it look like shingles and just like normal grey stone. In the end I did decide differently, but the shingles are gonna stay, so I'm doing ever so much lighter dry brushes of white. A dry brush is essentially where you use your brush, pick up a very tiny amount of paint, make sure it's evenly coated on the brush, but practically non-existent amount, and then you carefully brush it on top so it leaves just like a little bit of paint onto raised spots of your texture. I did stipple on the gesso when I applied it, so it has a nice little grainy texture here. And then I applied a sandy dry brush after the grey tones and a little bit of a brownish one. And then I highlighted some of the shingles just with some more grey paint. As for the body of the house, again, I wasn't too sure, but I wanted to go with stone colors. And since it worked so well with the whale that I made, like my LPS custom, I decided to add base colors of blue, red and yellow just to have some variation on the stone. And then dry brush it grey, and after I didn't like that, I immediately went in with red and decided I'm gonna do red stones as a contrast and maybe add some grey around the windows and stuff. But no matter how I tackled it from this step, since I was already layering it on top of the grey, it didn't really look right. So I decided to try and maybe see if a wash helps. It really didn't. By this point, I don't know, it didn't really look like stone, so I decided to just wait for it to dry and carve the door. Again, since this is very asymmetrical, I tried to work with the curves here. I did have to carve away the foam around the hinges after trying and seeing if it would work. I mean, I could have already guessed that I needed to remove it, but I guess I kept it on first because it was easier to just cut away on the outside of the door. But yeah, later I will carve those away. And after the first coat of white gesso, I decided to use the same gesso to fill in all the cracks and gaps between the stonework a little bit more. And I'm being very liberal here. The brush did remove a lot in between the gaps. I'm using my fingers here, which definitely worked better. And yes, you could use spackling, but my spackling that I have is very viscous. So this wouldn't have worked for this tiny gaps. But the gesso worked really great, and then I used a makeup brush that I have for crafting and applied the dry brush with that, just different shades of red. And that worked excellently, and after all that I'm just adding some grey to highlight the window frames. I think the grey really helps break up the just red fronts. And it kind of unifies it with the roof, because I also added it to the window part. And then I added some brown to the shutters and also to the door. And the door, of course, also needs a handle. So I added that too, in just picking out a plastic bead and some of this jewelry wire. It's wire that looks kind of like a nail on one side, and you can layer on beads and charms onto it and then make it into, I don't know, a necklace, a bracelet, earrings, all that kind of stuff. But it works really well for this project. I did put it in from the front, not quite regarding that I don't have really much access to the original carved out section in the door anymore to open it, and that meant that I actually had to make a kind of functional handle to open it. And with it being on top of the foam and the foam being soft, this didn't work, so later off camera I did actually use another one of those jewelry wire nails, and I put it in from the back, just essentially melting a hole into the plastic and then having it being held by the back of the plastic, so when I pull, the strain is not on the foam but on the plastic itself. And I did that only after, of course, testing it and ripping out half the foam. But I managed to fix it, luckily, in using the same bead that still had the plastic stuck to it. And then I painted everything. The hinges especially I painted in grey and then a metallic tone. And then I made sure to wash everything to really bring out all the details. A wash is essentially a thinned down version of paint. In this case I used black with a little bit of brown, mixed with a lot of water, and then you pour it over your project and you let it run into all the nooks and crannies, let it dry, and I dabbed off the excess so I don't have any streaks of paint running down, and this is the result. I did have to carve off a little bit of the plastic on the door to make it shut fully, but it doesn't click into place anymore because of the foam everywhere, but it definitely shuts more than enough, and since I don't use it as a portable toy, I'm more than happy with this. And I do have to say I'm really happy with trying to mimic the grout. I think this looks really nice, and overall I'm really happy with how it turned out. But this project is not done. This is technically only the first part. Since we have those spinning rooms on the inside, I want to add tiny dioramas on the inside. And here's where I need your guys' comments. I have some ideas of what I want to put into the rooms, but I'm not too sure about all of the rooms. But I thought of maybe adding an alchemist laboratory and a library or something. Something in that regard, maybe a little greenhouse situation or some stuff. But let me know in the comments down below. I'm going for a very fairy tale vibe, and I'm very limited in space, so I have to be a bit innovative how I use that tiny, more triangular piece of space that we have in there. But hopefully I can figure things out and work on the inside soon. That means it will likely take a little bit of time between the parts, but yeah, we have the outside done and it already looks much nicer than the storage piece of plastic that we had. That being said, I like that they have like a functional little toy for those minifigures. It's a very nice idea to have that as a carryable like little playset, I guess. But with the odd shapes, it was definitely a little bit harder to customize than I thought at first. Also, you may notice that the roof has like a little bit of a raised spot in some areas. That is where the logo was set on top, like the Doorable's logo. They added a raised spot there and I couldn't really cover it off since it's a thinner piece of plastic. So I just left it, and honestly, it just adds to the charm of this house hut thing that I made. But again, tell me in the comments down below which room ideas you have and also what you think of this project in general. And as always, I hope you have a great day. See you next time. Bye bye!